Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to be part of this series. Thank you to Marav and our friends at Hillel for your role in bringing me and the Hartman Institute here today. It's a huge honor to be part of this work, and I so admire the commitment of the college to engage in this kind of activity. A few years ago in The New Yorker, Jill Lepore has a great piece on what happened in the last great phase of American polarization, and there are a couple of answers as to how America wound up getting through that period of immense polarization. A big piece of it had to do with the Second World War and the galvanizing of Americans together as part of a shared enterprise. But she writes that underappreciated in that process were the efforts on local levels by educators, high school teachers, librarians, and civic leaders to create contexts for engagement across difference. You actually have to practice this kind of work in order to be good at it. And so I really appreciate the series that you're doing. I'm honored to be a part of it, and I feel especially privileged to be the 13th, which makes me the bar mitzvah of the Hunter College series. A year ago, I spent a weekend at a synagogue, as I oftentimes do, traveling around the country. I spent a weekend as a scholar in residence at a synagogue. And over the course of the weekend, you learn a lot about a particular community. In some ways, they all wind up blurring together over time. But I try, when I'm in these contexts, to discern as much as I can about what's the local color, and in particular, what are people agitated about? This is a good way to understand what's going on in a community. I'll talk about that a little bit more. What's agitating people? And in this particular congregation, it was a wonderful weekend. The thing that was agitating people more than any other issue was that approximately 3 months earlier, the synagogue caterer had changed suppliers of the tuna fish that was served at the light meal following services on Shabbat morning. Now you're laughing about this. Some of you may be members of synagogues. Some of you may just be able to identify, right? Some of you are like, they did that in my synagogue also. It's not a surprising story, right? Where when we talk about micro communities, smaller communities, people tend to focus on small scale issues and sometimes to elevate them out of proportion. But it was interesting to me, noticeable how many people raised it with various different viewpoints. Like, people are going to tell you that the new tuna fish is bad, but actually the old tuna fish was way worse. So be on our side, you guest, who will never come back to the synagogue again, has very little opinion about what's being served, versus other people who wanted to gripe about this story. Now, there's a lot to mock about what people fight about and about that particular issue. But I want to take an appreciative approach, because actually in watching and listening the way that this conversation took place in the congregation, I kind of zoomed out, not just at the time, but since then, not really about the tuna fish, but about what happens when there is conflict, valuable, productive conflict within a community. What does it tell us about the nature of community itself? And I can discern 4 things from the great tuna fish controversy of La Jolla. The first thing that the passion about tuna fish in this congregation suggested was that everybody cared about that one thing. They had a shared commitment to something. Now, in this case, it may sound very trivial, but actually when people argue about food, they're not arguing about anything trivial at all. In particular case of a community where people are observing rituals, and in this case, Shabbat together, what they eat together after services is something that they share. It's really valuable for them to stay in the congregation afterwards and to break bread with other members of their community. And it's important to them that that meal be done respectfully with the better tasting food. But more than that, synagogues are oftentimes the first gateway towards hospitality towards others. A new person comes into the community, and it's not just that members of a congregation want to show off what their synagogue is about. They want to feel as though the food that they are implicitly paying for through their membership is putting on a good, hospitable show towards others. Food practices are oftentimes derided by, certain type of scholars as being folkways, but this is actually the real stuff. It tells you a lot about what people's deep, passionate commitments are as it relates to home, hearth, and hospitality. And the fact that so many people had strong views about this suggested that they cared about it, not about the particular menu item, but about what was being served as part of an experience that they all valued and held in common. The second thing that the tuna fish controversy signaled was that there was an actually healthy culture of disagreement. Now, we can talk about whether the reason why there was a healthy culture of disagreement was because this was a small issue as opposed to a big issue, right? It would have been more alarming to me if, as a newcomer in this community, people would confess to me that what they were really angry about was the performance of the rabbi, the decisions of the capital campaign, right? Intra-communal tensions that were taking place between them and their neighbors or with city officials. So the fact that this was a more minor issue may seem that it is less significant in terms of what it testifies. But I actually noticed, and I appreciated, that this was a community that knew how to argue with each other, knew how to do it passionately, and that disagreement was not destroying the fiber and fabric of this community. In fact, periodically, multiple people came to express their opinion about the tuna fish at the same time and kind of noticed and laughed that they were engaged in a big debate in this congregation, and they were campaigning and lobbying with outsiders to somehow be on their side. That idea I'll come back to. What does it look like to actually practice the habit of disagreement? And as I'll try to argue a little later on, one of the reasons why it's important to practice the habit of disagreement on minor issues is because it refines our capacity to be able to withstand those kind of moments when it relates to major issues. The third thing that this episode testifies to when we think about community is that, by and large, healthy communities are places where everybody has decided that they gain more by belonging than they lose by sublimating what they want on any particular issue. And more than that, they are environments where people feel that they can trust that even when they lose on one particular issue, that loss will not be weaponized against them to make them lose on every single issue. There's an economic trade-off that all of us make when it comes to thinking about communities that we belong. Do I gain more than I lose? Right? And we've all had moments in our lives when you realize, no, I'm actually losing more than I'm gaining by belonging to this community, and that's a good signal that it's time to leave. But in this particular case, the people who were so angry about the change in tuna fish catering were not in the synagogue. Everybody who was there had decided that as aggrieved as they were about this particular issue, they decided to stay because they were gaining something in return on the other end. And nobody said to me, I lost on this issue, and now the people who won are not only forcing it down our throat, but they're also changing the egg salad order. In other words, they trusted that a short-term loss was not going to yield a longer-term loss in terms of power and authority and make them vulnerable. I guess the fourth thing that I discerned in this moment and noticed about it was that this was a community that had decided to value the activity of compromise itself and the value of community itself as an independent good. The reason why this is significant is that oftentimes the activity of compromise is viewed, and I'm going to go into greater detail on this, the activity of compromise is viewed as a concession we make that is rooted in loss. But sometimes the activity of compromise or of building community is not the inferior version of the world that we wish we could have, but it is the attainment of something greater than possibly even the victory on any particular issue. It is a good in and of itself. Now, I would suggest that the great tuna fish analogy is more applicable to questions of community that we face both nationally and in much larger institutions that may appear on its face. As I said, not only because all of those lessons about community, that we gain more than we lose, we have environments of trust, that there's an independent good, that we're good at arguing with each other, and that we have shared commitments, these are far bigger ideas than the example to which they are applied. but also because, as I suggested, when you have communities that are capable of managing significant difference across difference, communities that can celebrate their diversity as a hallmark of strength, right? It makes you resilient from the small cases to be able to develop a culture that can withstand the harder cases. Oftentimes, I would suggest communities that fall apart on the basis of a hard issue, it is not just because of the nature of the issue. It may be because our habits and our capacities have been atrophied by not investing in the small issues. We erode those capacities over time, and then we are surprised that our notion of community falls apart much faster than we anticipate. There is a crisis of community taking place in this country on both a national level and on a local level. We know this in a whole variety of sites and how it shows up. Before we even get to institutions or large-scale communities, there's an epidemic of loneliness in America, which originates and is related to, I don't know if it's causal or correlative, it's connected to the fact that we, most of us, do not belong to communities without a sense of agency to leave. Other eras in our history, and I'm very sensitive to this as a Jew, most Jewish communities that Jews lived in throughout Jewish history were not communities of choice. It wasn't like I choose to only live in this shtetl together with other Jews. I certainly have not chosen to be ghettoized. We've lived in coerced communities, given the opportunity and the availability, and now not just for Jews, but as a hallmark of the characteristic of Americanness, which is about the searching for self, the departure from home, the building out of one's own identity. That is kind of core feature of what it means to be American. We've produced a civilization where it is possible for people to pursue their own independent flourishing without having to belong to any community whatsoever. And here the transformations around the dependence on community are not merely constrained to the Jewish community, but to Americans more broadly. Many sociologists have written about this, perhaps most famously, Bowling Alone, right? The disappearance of the civic infrastructure, the dependencies on social clubs, on all of the other aspects of American identity from the 1950s and 60s that have given way to a different way of living that allows us to live independently and possibly even flourish in a whole variety of ways without dependency on the work of community. And by the way, what that means is we don't have to make compromises and trade-offs in order to have the things that we want. I can curate my choices if I am completely atomized as an individual outside of the framework of community. We need not subordinate our own needs to the needs of others as part of a trade-off for the benefits of belonging on the other end. Before we get to communities and institutions, we know that we as Americans are not arguing well anymore. Now, I don't want to be super nostalgic for some greater era in American history. Periods of times that are oftentimes characterized as a more bipartisan era invariably involved the silencing and sidelines of positions that were uncomfortable. I don't want to be too nostalgic about something. I'll just describe this as a present tense moment. We don't argue particularly well as Americans, and that's partly because of this atomizing of identity as opposed to community. If you are a person who is in community all the time, you will engage in arguing. There's no way around it. It's the inevitable consequence of having to live together with human beings and having to pursue and build something bigger than yourself. But if you don't have to belong to communities, there's no reason really that you should have to be engaged in arguing all that much, and that will atrophy your capacity to engage in that very activity that is essential to the work of democracy. Obviously, a huge feature of this is social media, the locating of ourselves within echo chambers, the myth that we believe around social media, which is that it actually is a tool for building community. It is not. And it's no surprise that there is such a weird, jarring disconnect between the way that people argue with people who they know and who are in relationship with, and the way that people argue on the internet, where there's sometimes a myth of familiarity and kinship and a sense of intimacy with the people who you're arguing with, and you don't notice over time that you are basically yelling at other people in ways that you would never do when you were confronting them face to face. As a result of many of the social anxieties that we face, part of the reason we don't argue particularly well is that many of us are anxious about a whole variety of things: climate, economy, leadership, everything. I'm going to give you a list. What are we anxious about, right? That anxiety has a weird effect on many of us who operate in positions of leadership to believe that it's our responsibility to help reduce that anxiety in others. And arguing about those issues does not oftentimes reduce that anxiety, it raises the temperature. So that very environment that we're in breeds a disinterest in actually engaging in the work of refining our capacity to argue. And ultimately, I think the real big fear that we are operating with in this country is that we don't really ultimately trust each other. If one of the core premises of why I continue to belong to something, in spite of the fact that I lose often, the goal is that you should lose maybe half the time, right? That's a lot, right? If you don't really trust that if I lose this time, I still have the possibility of winning next time. If losers cannot trust that winners will protect them, ultimately you will see the dramatic erosion of the capacity of trust in any community, institution, or society. Most of these challenges are most visible right now in America in the largest scale renderings that we have of community, aka our country. Liberal democracy, in many ways, is the world's grandest experiment at the very notion of constructing community. To believe and belong in a liberal democracy is to be rooted in the premise that you are building a community across difference. It is predicated on Rawls's pluralism as a matter of fact. Human beings are different, and an experiment to say we are better off by incorporating that difference into our societies, building technologies and tools to be able to both value that and to form some sort of social and political policy that implicates all of us, and to ultimately trust that if all of us put our chips in the same bag, that it will be protected. We will not lose in that process. And needless to say, at that large scale, there is a lot to suggest that the forces of polarization around the world, the rise of deep distrust in the liberal democratic project on both the right and the left, are eroding enough of the trust that even though the vast majority of Americans, I would suggest, still want the liberal democratic experiment, you're going to reach a tipping point where enough Americans don't, that it makes it too risky for the majority to continue to trust in that system. We see that happening all around us. But it happens, it spills down, it trickles down from the largest scale rendering of this question to then smaller orders of magnitude. It's clearly at play in our universities. The reason why the universities have drawn so much heat and light over the last couple of years is because they have become visible as places that were once understood as the anchors of the liberal democratic communal ideal, places that absorbed a tremendous amount of difference, didn't homogenize people on the other end, but created at least an environment where that difference was productive to the life of the university as opposed to destructive. And when more and more students of a whole variety of backgrounds report that the climate in the university makes them feel unsafe, they are signaling that one of the truths of community is simply not working for them. And the minute that some distrust emerges in that system, you will see distrust emerge on exactly the other end of any particular reciprocal issue. But by and large, I would tell you that this doesn't merely happen at large-scale communities. It is happening in microcosm in different communities across the country. The tuna fish example was a silly one in some ways. But I can tell you from traveling around, and I focus mostly on the Jewish community, there are more and more cases of Jewish Americans leaving their communities to belong to other communities where they can find homogeneity as opposed to difference. That doesn't seem crazy, right? You kind of want to be together with your people to some degree, but why is it the case that our people has moved from one marker to a different marker in a short period of time? Just to give that color. American Jews used to be organized by denominational categories. This is a Reform temple, this is a conservative synagogue, this is an Orthodox synagogue, and those were marked by doctrinal differences and difference in practice and in Jewish law. And by and large today, those doctrinal issues matter a lot less to American Jews, but partisan political identification matters a lot more. I can tell you in a lot of places, people are leaving one congregation because it doesn't actually align with their partisan American political politics, to move to a different congregation that does, despite the fact that that means that they're also traveling towards a different doctrinal understanding of Judaism, a different practice of Judaism, and needless to say, totally different menu at Kiddush, right? They're willing to actually jettison all of those markers of difference in search of a different homogenizing tendency. What it means is, on a certain set of issues that they consider to be most important, they don't want to spend their time arguing. They don't want to do it. So instead of feeling angry and having to argue with others, I will simply look for homogeneity of my viewpoint somewhere else. This is just community not working as it is supposed to do. Those feelings that any community is supposed to generate, that we're all there for the same purpose, a culture of healthy disagreement, a sense of safety and trust. I want to talk a little bit about what we might do. And to use the case of a university or even the case of a particular community to think about what might you do to withstand these trends, to name and notice. And I feel this is important for us to say. When you see something like this taking over a whole society, as polarization is doing to all of us, where Americans, for instance, are relocating geographically to live in congressional districts with people with whom they vote, right? So the notion that the bloc party is a place where you get together across difference. I mean, I can't remember the last time that there's been a bloc party. I remember it as a kid. Bloc parties actually were really important where I grew up because it was a new modern Orthodox Jewish community had moved into a neighborhood that was not predominantly Orthodox. There were some mixed feelings among our neighbors. And once a year there was a bloc party. And everybody actually saw each other and politely spoke to each other. I don't think bloc parties by and large still exist, but it's not that interesting if you're living basically in an ideologically homogenous enclave. Then you don't really need a bloc party. You already trust each other, right, in some sense, and then you don't need the activities that create community across difference. I want to suggest that we need to engage in a few activities that are about cultivating habits. And then I'm going to make a bigger argument about a value that we need to start going to bat for. The habits are practices that may sound a little bit small, but like any commitments that you undertake in an environment where your ideals are being challenged, they are actually hard work. They are not small. The first, and this was an interesting thing, I asked a bunch of my colleagues at the Hartman Institute, we're a think tank on major questions, what are the kinds of things that we as American Jews could be thinking about and investing in to withstand this polarization moment? And one thing that it was very surprising, a whole bunch of my colleagues gave the same answer, which was some version of potluck dinners. It sounds very trivial, but it's not small. Potluck dinners, we have one in our community. It happens to be that we're all friends already, so it's not exactly the right kind of potluck. We also have curated that only people who can cook well come to the potluck, which is that's a whole other elitist choice. But potluck as an idea, as a habit, is one of the activities that people do or that can create community to achieve that item that I listed near the beginning of what are the activities that make people feel that what they gain out of community is more than what they risk by belonging. Potlucks build social habits, they build social connections, they build a sense of like, There's something spiritual and powerful about both breaking bread, doing it together with others, contributing something to something that is common. Those are powerful instruments that nobody feels that when you do those kinds of activities, you have now made people identical to one another. You have not homogenized difference. You probably don't want to use the potluck as a place for a spirited political argument, except those that emerge organically once people feel comfortable enough that they can actually start talking to one another. But it is virtually impossible, so it sounds small, but it's virtually impossible to imagine the success of community at the other end without having curated those habits all along. I would say, just as an observation, my guess is that the universities where the most conflict has emerged in the last couple of years were environments that had allowed those activities to atrophy. That assumed that communities of diversity would simply find ways to work along, to get along with one another, as opposed to naming that you have to break down a large environment made up of a lot of diverse people and engage in constant and relentless community activity buildings at the smallest scale. You cannot imagine the possibility of large-scale community building without atomizing to some degree the problem. The second habit we can cultivate, and this also is hard work, is practicing and training in argumentation. This is one of the things that's most strange to me about the struggles at universities, which is, as educational environments, this could have been one of the great contributions, or can still be, that universities make to our public intellectual environment, practicing the art of arguing. My university, my alma mater, has a core curriculum. Make it part of the core curriculum. One semester on arguing well. Right? Why not? This is a habit of democracy. This was like the great contribution that the Greeks make to us, is the art of rhetoric and argumentation. Teach it. Practice it. We are not going to organically learn how to argue well with one another when we operate in our social media silos, in our independent values and independent communities. We are only going to get good at it if we find techniques and tactics to practice this activity, to make good arguments which are powerful, productive, and don't always result in one side winning the argument and the other side losing the argument. And the only way to be good at it in wartime is when you practice it in peacetime. Now, to be honest, I have people in my life who I'm close to who I have not argued with about Israel-Palestine since the war started, even though I had spent years practicing those arguments beforehand. Just because you're practiced at it doesn't mean you have to have that argument all of the time. You can also decide, we probably could go toe-to-toe on this really well for a few hours and not kill each other, which is already pretty good. We could go for a while and not kill each other, but I still don't want to do that right now. That's also an okay outcome. But there's no chance that you'll be able to engage in that work productively if you haven't honed the skills during peacetime. And the third habit that we can cultivate, is reminding people about the core thing that they share in common. Right? Like the synagogue, when everyone cared about the meal served after services, if members of a community don't believe that they are held together by some shared commitments, they will lose the bonds to that idea of community that'll make them willing to engage with the risky activity of fighting in the moment. Here, where I felt really sad, and I want to be clear, this is not in any way a criticism of this campus. This is a larger critique. It was very troubling to me that at a lot of the universities, it felt to me as though the core mission of being an environment for education and advancement was lost in the story. These felt like these weren't really environments that everybody understood what they were there for. And when people have difference of opinion about what they perceive themselves being there for, what they'd be willing to do to destroy that environment becomes variable and quite different. So there are good examples, actually, cases of depolarization. A colleague of ours at Hartman, Professor Sarah Wolf, who teaches at the Jewish Theological Seminary, has a great essay in our journal a couple of years ago about a moment that she noticed on the Columbia campus when the very students who actually were divided on Israel-Palestine in profound ways actually defended each other in the face of external actors who were trying to polarize the campus further. So, for instance, pro-Israel students who actually went outside to block the doxing trucks that were out there to dox the pro-Palestinian students. And she said she observed this and spoke to her students about it afterwards. And you get like the checklist. They were invested in something communal that was bigger to them than the issue of Israel-Palestine on their campus. And it made them more interested in making sure that their fellow students were protected than it was winning on the issue, which might have been enabled them to take advantage of the doxing situation. So there are cases of good depolarization. I was particularly proud also of my father, who's a retired diplomat, and spent basically the first year of the war at the Princeton campus just doing public educational events together with other colleagues in international relations and political science who disagreed about the war. And in some ways, having university faculty modeling what public disagreement could look like defanged some of the controversy on the campus. Students admired what their faculty members were doing, and then that became the anchor for a version of debating these issues which are worthy of debate and of passionate viewpoints within the university environment. But in addition to cultivating habits, I want to suggest that in order for us to get past this moment, and I think, by the way, we could say enough, just those habits are really, really powerful for us to think about in addressing the challenges that we have. But I want to argue that there's a fourth thing. The fourth thing that I learned out of the tuna salad episode, which is the case for thinking of compromise and community, not merely as technologies that enable us to have something else, but in which we think of them as independent values of their own merit. How is compromise moved from being an accommodation rooted in some sense of loss to being construed as its own moral good? Now, I'll use the case of my own community, the Jewish community, to illustrate this. The real issue, one of the real issues that I feel that we have in the Jewish community, is that there are a lot of values you could say are the most essential Jewish value. And for a variety of interesting reasons, I don't want to go into all of them, over the last 50 years, the claim of justice has emerged as the most dominant, publicly articulated Jewish value by liberal Jews. There's a good reason for this. The Bible says it's really important in a bunch of places, right? There's a good claim. God actually says in God's internal monologue speaking about Abraham and the issue of the unrighteousness at Sodom, God says, why am I hiding from Abraham what I'm about to do? Didn't I want him and his descendants to stand for justice? So there's a good argument that's really, really important. But there is an equivalently good argument that in much of Jewish tradition that followed, and especially in the rabbinic period, when there was far less certainty about divine will, when you couldn't walk around and say, I know exactly what God wants out of me, when Jews throughout Jewish history had to find themselves in communities of difference coercively, that the rabbis begin to articulate that the value of compromise is not a lesser version of justice. It is not, I wish I could have justice, but I'm left with compromise. That they begin to argue that the morality of compromise is an independent good that sometimes triumphs over the commitment to justice. Justice makes me feel right. Compromise enables me to live with others. Justice, penetrates, the rabbis say, like a sword. Compromise brings us together. As the rabbis say, Moses is the justice figure of the Bible, and he is feared by the people. Aaron is the peace-loving template in our tradition, and he is beloved. These are competing values. So to imagine compromise, that commitment as somehow as lesser than justice, is always going to lose in the marketplace of values of commitments. There are a whole variety of historically specific reasons why the Jewish community and other faith and ethnic communities in this country have gravitated over the last 50 years to the language of justice. A lot of it has to do with the civil rights movement. A lot of it has to do with the perception that on a whole set of issues we are moving backwards. But I want us to think about the costs, the moral costs of a commitment to something like justice and the costs that it brings towards a notion of community. Compromise is rooted less in certainty and the more in the need for each other. It tells a story of something that we considered not to be an accident of difference, but a commitment to preserving difference in and of itself and not allowing that difference to pull us apart. I opened with a case study, right? A case study on how a particular community navigates a particularly trivial challenge. I suggested that there's actually a lot of wisdom in probing communities' controversies because always communities' controversies are witnesses to their values. When people are fighting about something, it tells you what's important to them. And in this particular case, it told us that there was something really important about this. It told us that they felt safe enough to be able to trust each other because there was something they were getting on the other end. It told us that they had a healthy culture of disagreement, and it also suggested that the value of community of itself was paramount. It suggested all of the ways in which we see and we are living a period of polarization that is pulling us apart on the local level, on the institutional level, and on the national level. I think it's okay to acknowledge we did not create these challenges. They've been brought upon us. One of the most powerful experiences I had the last number of years was I had a consultation with a university president who was new in her role. And we spent about an hour and a half talking about Israel-Palestine on campus. And at the end of the call, she just said to me, "I'm really grateful for this because you helped me understand I didn't create the Israeli-Palestinian conflict." It's easy to see sometimes when you're in an institution that's pulled apart by conflict to feel that that is a failure of leadership. And it's not. These are big issues that divide all of us. Our challenge is not to figure out how to solve the massive polarization challenge independently, but to figure out whether we can build resilient communities that then, taken together, might be an antidote to this challenge. I suggested a handful of habits for us to invest in, and ultimately a commitment, which is not just a habit, but a commitment to a value systems that prioritizes and orientations towards compromise and towards community as independent values. I want to conclude just by saying that for all of us as autonomous, independent individuals, there is an audacity in belonging. It's an audacious thing to do. There is also a miracle in community. It's amazing when it works. I think we are bidden to notice that in ourselves, to say where are the communities in our lives that work for us, that make us want to keep coming back even though we're not always right, that provide us with spiritual, material sustenance, that make us feel that we gain something more than we lose, and to use that as a template to build even bigger and more powerful institutions in which we can all thrive. Thank you very much. I think we have two microphones in the room, so we're happy to take some questions and comments.
Any questions?
Yes, over here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. I so value your appreciation for conflict as an area to learn from. One of the things you talked about, though, I wonder about thinking about prioritizing compromise over justice and how you fit in the differing power relations in that kind of conversation.
Do you want to say another sentence on?
Sure. Compromise can privilege those with greater power over those with less power. Mm-hmm. So what looks like a compromise to me, it might look like meeting you halfway, but in reality, because I know I have less power than you, I'll meet you much farther, much closer to your needs than my needs.
Yeah, there was I think about this through an essay I read a few years ago by Linda Zerilli at the University of Chicago. Her essay is called "Against Civility." And her argument is premised on the idea that civility is oftentimes adduced by the powerful to suppress the dissent of the less powerful. So oftentimes calls for civility, and we know this, by the way, with any relationship that you have with any other human being. If you say to somebody, calm down, it is always going to have the opposite effect, right? Tone down your argument, this is what we call tone policing, all of those concerns. And the same risk is at present all the time in negotiations and compromises across difference. So, in any good negotiation, in any good compromise, the end outcome has to lead to a reality where both parties and all sides believe that they have gained something better on the other end than they have been willing to lose. As my colleague Tal Becker, who's a negotiator, has been an Israeli-Palestinian negotiator for decades, says, your goal in the negotiation room is to figure out how to write your opponent's victory speech. That's the goal. Unfortunately, that has not worked, right? They've been trying, but it has not worked. But that orientation towards compromise is an acknowledgement, right? That there are not only power differentials, but there are different outcomes that both parties want to have as part of this process. And the good faith version of this is to say, I know that I bring this particular set of strengths, maybe even a power imbalance, but my goal is to figure out how to actually live together with you. In practice, that's what the hard work is ultimately about, right? It's also why, healthy communities of dissent will have practiced difference enough to know that just because 7 people said this and 3 people said that, it doesn't mean that we now objectively have concluded that the position of the 7 is stronger than the position of the 3. One of the things that I most appreciate about the rabbinic tradition and its orientation towards difference is that it also incorporates other habits like a commitment to publish the dissent. One of the most powerful things about the Talmud is that you get the winning position, but you get all the merits and argumentation of the losing position. And the rabbis tell us why. They say because later on in Jewish history, the power dynamic may have changed, and we want to be able to demonstrate when other people come along that they have equal credibility to make a claim with continuity of the past than the ones that won. Societies that don't publish dissents, right, are basically trying to argue that the outcome was inherently just, right? We have to cultivate that habit whether we are on the powerful side or on the vulnerable side. And it does get to that point that you are able to then say, I approach this not about winning and losing on the particular issue, but about getting to a better outcome on the other end. And I'll give you one last example from our work. We engaged in a very, very complicated project for years, trying to bridge the relationship between American Muslims and American Jews by addressing the complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the way in which it implicates our identities as proxy warriors on behalf of a conflict very far away. And it's no surprise, actually, that proxy warriors on behalf of a conflict are oftentimes more passionate and more dogmatic about that conflict than even the people engaged in the conflict itself. Right? And that's a pretty good example has been what's happened in American life over the past 18 months between pro-Israel camp and pro-Palestinian camp. One of the things that we did as part of that project was because we were getting so much pushback about our hidden agenda, which was public, and about the power dynamic between us and the participants, is that we published our self-interests. We are doing this for this purpose. This is the self-interest of our Muslim leadership. There was something like about just saying, we know there are complicated dynamics in this relationship, but sometimes those dynamics are worse when they're unarticulated. So when you're able to actually put on the table, this is what I bring to the table, these are my assets, my resources, and my goals, and to do it transparently, now I know I'm in a real negotiation because I know that it's not going to be, you're not going to feel as though this negotiation or this dialogue was serious or successful if it only achieved my objectives. And I have to know that I'm listening to your objectives as well. And then, great, then let the power dynamics play out. Because ultimately, I may want to win in that negotiation, and you may want to win too. But at least we're being honest about that as opposed to trying to mask it as something else. Okay. Yeah.
Hi. You talked a lot about reminding people about the commonalities that we have in these communities as a way of combating polarization. And you also mentioned earlier on how in the largest community that we have, the country, that there's a lot of people who have kind of left the value of liberal democracy at the wayside. They either no longer believe in it or I don't know. Do you think that the correct way to move forward in this moment is to kind of try and recultivate that idea of liberal democracy to get an overwhelming support for it, or do you think that we need to be finding new and different commonalities inside of our country?
I personally believe that the only way forward for American liberal democracy is through liberal democracy. I'm not convinced that on the individual level or in the micro community level that first of all is a branding problem, but that as a cause is sufficient to build the kind of fabric that would make possible liberal democracy to flourish. In other words, liberal democracy is ultimately a governing system, but it's a governing system that is predicated on, do people want to belong to diverse environments in which they sometimes win, sometimes lose, can bring their passions to bear, and trust that they will be safer for the long run for that activity. So that's why it does, block parties and potlucks and public debates actually do matter, because then it takes those commitments, translates them into local expressions that make people feel what they're trying to aim for, and then they ultimately see the liberal democratic mode of governance as something that they want to participate in more generally. In general, like getting people to belong to big, lofty aspirations is much harder than helping them to figure out what do they gain from it in their particular environment. One of the things that's very troubling to me in general about the way we've designed America is that the grandest experiment that we have around an encounter with difference and the desire to participate in purpose-driven community, right, for the attainment of something greater happens at the university. That's why the university was such a powerful instrument, has been, for social, economic, political mobility, for bridge building, for networking, all of these things. But then we've designed the rest of societies not to look like universities. So at minimum, we got to be really good at universities to cultivate that habit. And then we have to start thinking about, how do we do university-like work outside of the university? Over here in this room. And then I think the president of the university gets the next question. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, sorry. I accede to an understanding of negotiation or debate as being an exercise essentially in appealing to the naked self-interest of otherwise irreconcilable sides. At the same time, I mean, that's cynical, but at the same time, what is the role of a quote-unquote impartial negotiator? No negotiator or mediator can be perfectly impartial, but what is the role? What role do some people who have a vested interest in maintaining a liberal democracy, or perhaps in trying to revitalize institutions in order to foster sort of a renewed investment in that system, how much do they need to abdicate some of their own positions, at least publicly, in order to mediate or in order to interpret?
Yeah, I would think that what I'm most interested in is environments where the goal of the negotiator, right, or the judge or the mediator is actually not neutral. It's neutral as relates to the particulars of the conflict, but it is motivated by a desire to preserve the peace, to create an environment where there is as little loss as possible and as little disruption to the fabric. So I'll give you an example from my own tradition. So the rabbis take an example of what happens when two litigants show up before a judge or before a panel of judges, both claiming equal ownership of a garment. Now, from the parameters of truth and justice, we know that one of these claimants is lying. Empirically, you know that one of the claimants is lying. One of them actually owns it, and one of them is making a claim that is wrong, right? So if your job as a judge is to perceive yourself as impartial on the issue and ultimately responsible for justice, you are going to pursue a process of discernment to make sure, as much as possible, that the right claimant got what they were supposed to get. But what the rabbis ultimately say is, both sides have to swear that they own the garment. In other words, the question of lying now sits with the individual. You want to be a liar? That's on you. And our job is to then split the value of the garment. Because ultimately, rabbis don't tell us that this is what they're doing. Ultimately, they don't really care about the justice question of who owned the garment. They care about the peace question of whether we can have a system to live together. Now, this raises all sorts of the power questions too. I know, we can circle back to that, right? Ultimately, it can privilege liars. We know that. But what we're also saying is the answer of truth and justice is not the only thing that lays claim on us. A commitment to be in a society that has rules and regulations that allows people ultimately to get even partial outcomes that they were hoping for, but to live together with other people is its own independent value. I would love to think it's kind of case by case. Where does the question of the judge, the mediator, and litigator sit? But it's not about neutrality in the larger social gain. It's about neutrality on the issues, but the pursuit of something ultimately that is better for the society or community that they are responsible to. Yes.
So you must be a social psychologist, right?
I'm not. I'm a historian.
So I am
Yes.
a social psychologist. And when I listen, what I hear is the classic social psychology dilemma of intra-group solidarity and intergroup dialogue. And I feel that every day being a leader of an institution. How do we understand and create the context in which that potluck can happen because people are allowed to belong to their group? How do you get community and compromise being the front and center values without empowering people to feel safely within their group?
Their own particular group.
You know, who likes which tuna fish is not a trivial
Right.
moment, right? When you're building community. And I think for universities, that has been the existential dilemma of the last 18 months. I mean, so I guess I say this both hugely impressed with what you're saying, and yet how do we get people to see that it's okay to have intra-group solidarity as a stepping stone to intergroup dialogue? And you actually can't get to good intergroup dialogue
Without intro.
without.
Yeah, I guess I want to play out some. Maybe we continue this, but I want to play out some thought experiments about what has to come first. Right. I think that there has been a prevailing shift in communities built on higher education really since the 60s, where the construct has now been understood as this is a large-scale construct made up of different micro-communities that can be defined by race, ethnicity, and religion. There's a lot of data to suggest that that's certainly in the Hillel world, that's essentially how Hillel's came about, was largely because of identity politics on campus. And then the language of kind of safety and strength got wrapped around particular communities. And then you're asking, how do I then bridge from intragroup solidarity to intergroup? But maybe that's not the right directionality of this whole thing. Maybe to assume that the work is to create bridges across difference only once I have built intragroup solidarity is setting you up to actually position that intragroup solidarity as an enemy of intergroup work. Maybe part of the language, that's why I just keep saying maybe. Well, whatever worked until now is not working. Maybe part of the problem actually is that, and I know you're right from my own experience, right? I know that the formative pluralistic experiences that I had, or at least in my own narrative, only worked because I was secure in my own particular identity. I understand that. But the other thing that worked about those pluralistic environments was that they managed to persuade me that there was something bigger that I wanted to commit to and belong to. And that's where I'm worried that if we assume that this one thing has to precede the other, that's a setup. And the question really is, how do you actually cultivate those two commitments simultaneously? That when you show up as a student on a campus, You are given the tools and the access and the language to understand that you belong to something way bigger than your own particular group, without forcing you to exit from your own particular group. And there's limited time, and there's limited attention spans, and 18-year-olds are going to pull themselves in different directions, whether they have kind of particularistic instincts or universalistic instincts. But I think that's the calibration is where we need to get to. Simultaneous, yeah. Do I have time for a couple more? One more? I have, let me take the three and then I'll answer all together, okay? So I have one and then one in the back and then here, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I really enjoyed and really agree with and resonate the idea that compromise is essentially the only alternative. I have some things written down, but compromise with all its merits seems to be sort of a hard sell in my experience, especially when it comes not just to rhetoric, but to actions, where if one party believes that the actions of another party are like genuinely detrimental, fundamentally detrimental to the Jewish community. If one side believes the other side is like a terrorist sympathizer, compromise seems like a hard sell. And in my experience, again, the only way that I've seen this overcome is with love, radical, unexception, like without exception, just ahavas Yisrael, just love for each other. Do you think that, in that sense, it looks like compromise? Could it just be like compromise is just love wearing different clothes?
Thank you.
But are they one and the same? Is it something different, or can it be achieved through some other means? Or are they one and the same?
Great, thank you. Yeah. Oh, here first and then in the back.
Yeah, first of all, our synagogue issue was lox, not tuna fish, and which you know. But I'm also wanting to go even to bring in for me, the bigger picture. We live in a country where, for me, it feels as if the leaders want no compromise. The government, let me say that. And how do we then build what you're talking about, which I love, into academia when the forces seem to be coming at us that say you can't do this?
Yes, last one.
I guess it's more of a comment. I just felt like this whole entire talk was so out of touch with reality based on what's happening at Hunter College specifically, at CUNY in general, where there's literally people who are not angry about the tuna fish, but espousing Jew hatred. And I mean, it's happening every single day in this room. There was somebody who had a blood libel about Jews or Israel committing a genocide live on television for everybody. This is not something that we can say, you know what, go with a different brand of tuna fish. And so I did find this talk at best out of touch with reality, and at worst extremely offensive. So I just wanted to share that. I'm sure it's really hard to hear that, but I think it's also important to express that.
I can take it.
Thank you.
I'll just, all I can say on that is my job here is not to weigh in on the internal dynamics of this college. I'm not a stakeholder here, and I certainly wouldn't do so in the presence of its leadership, except if asked. And that probably would happen in a different venue. My goal here as a scholar and as a guest is to consider some of the larger dynamics and trends that are taking our society. And I suspect that actually some of the same technologies and methodologies that could be used on a local level could be mapped out to even the hardest questions that we face. Compromise is a hard sell. I understand that. Actually, the best articulation of this is by Sir Isaiah Berlin in his commencement address in the University of Toronto in 1994, Message to the 21st Century, where he says we must bargain and measure, weigh, and compromise all of the different moral claims that are made on us. And he says, he quotes, "I know this is not the idealistic flag under which young men and women wish to march. It sounds too tame, too bourgeois." He says, but you must believe me, after the lessons of the totalitarianism of the 21st century, we don't really have a choice. Our only choice is to build societies that privilege difference as opposed to insisting on the morality of one particular truth or the other. I think part of the reason why compromise is a hard sell in an atmosphere where people believe that their claims are not only rooted in justice, but even apropos your comments, sir, is rooted in a sense of safety. once you believe that the positions that are held by others are actually endangering you, there's no room to compromise with those, right? Then that it shatters that very notion that the community itself protects me, right? If you feel that members of your own community are actually endangering you, then something really makes it not only impossible to compromise, but actually offensive to start compromising. And we have to know the limits between who we can compromise and who we can't with. But your language in return may be part of the antidote. Maybe the language of community is not merely about community in an abstract sense, but about something deeper than that we are committed to one another because we see them as shared travelers in the human condition, because they create obligations upon us, that we see them truly for what they are. And that may be, in order to capture back the sense that you have once you're on the slippery slope of feeling threatened by other people all the time. How do you cultivate the habit of being capable of loving other people more than you're scared of them? And the last piece, part of the reason our politicians are preying on our fears of one another is because we are letting them. We're letting them. Citizens are sovereigns. There are a whole bunch of very technical reasons. Gerrymandering is another reason that it actually creates polarized incentives. But this ultimately will come down to citizens. Good citizens will ultimately repudiate the capacity of our politicians to divide us. I don't know what to do about the echo chambers that are a lot of circles within within academia. I do, however, think that some of the work that I talked about today, teaching disagreement as a habit of the universities, modeling and insisting that these are places of critical inquiry, of public discourse, of difference, could be a useful reminder to shift that balance, which has already started to happen in higher education. Danielle Allen was profiled this week in the New Yorker exactly on this, on the pushback against what are we trying to do at the university level is very different when it's framed as the advancement of very particular types of truth in the framework of justice, rather than environments that are about cultivating the mind, the spirit, and ultimately these communities that we've created. Thank you very much.